Hello, good evening. I think we're getting started. There's still a few more people coming in, but that's fine because I have an intro to give first. So it's my pleasure to, and honor actually, to introduce Professor Robert Sutton, who we all know as Bob, at today's forum. And I've known you for almost 2 decades. I figured that out. That's kind of frightening. And I just wanted to say before I launch into your official bio that I've always been very impressed with what a generous, entertaining, fun guy you are, as well as being a distinguished professor and becoming very well-known writer as well. So, and your bio is very impressive, and I cut it down a little bit, but I still have a few things to say here. So I'll launch into this. So he's a professor of management science and engineering and a professor of organizational behavior by courtesy at Stanford. And he's been teaching classes on the psychology of business and management at Stanford since 1983. Yeah. He's the co-founder of the Stanford Technology Ventures Program and the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, aka the D School. And he's also co-founder of the Center for Work, Technology and Organization, which he co-directed from 1996 to 2006. And that was how I met you back in 1996. So Bob studies innovation, leaders and bosses, evidence-based management, the links between knowledge and organizational action, workplace civility, and scaling excellence. And he's published over 100 articles and chapters on these topics in peer-reviewed journals and the popular press. His books include Weird Ideas That Work, 11.5 Practices for Promoting, Managing, and Sustaining Innovation, The Knowing-Doing Gap, How Smart Firms Turn Knowledge into Action with Jeffrey Pfeiffer, and Hard Facts, Dangerous Half-Truths, and Total Nonsense, Profiting from Evidence-Based Management, also with Jeffrey. His books, The No Asshole Rule, Building a Civilized Workplace and Surviving One That Isn't, and Good Boss, Bad Boss, How to Be the Best and Survive the Worst, are both New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestsellers. And his new book, the basis of today's forum, Scaling Up Excellence, Getting to More Without Settling for Less with Huggy Rao, was published earlier this month. And he's received awards from the Academy of Management Journal and the Academy of Management Review, and from Stanford for his teaching. And his books have been selected as Best Business Book of 2006 by Toronto Globe and Mail. And Sutton himself was named as one of 10 B-School All-Stars by Business Week and was selected by Business 2.0 as a leading management guru in 2002. And he's a fellow at IDEO and an academic director of 3 Stanford executive education programs. And his personal blog is Work Matters at www.bobsutton.net. And he also blogs at Harvard Business Review and is an influencer on LinkedIn. And he tweets at @work_matters. Thank you. Thank you, Bob.
Oh, my God. Thank you. So it's actually kind of embarrassing. But, and most of my Stanford colleagues think I've gone to the dark side and do not do respectable work. So they could do a different introduction than that. So what I'm going to do, I'm trying to remember, this is my 3rd or 4th PARC forum, and somebody probably could look it up, but I've done a number of them here before, so I sort of show up every few years after spending a few months, or actually a few years in solitary confinement in my garage typing. Those things that all go on. I sometimes go to meetings, but I always go back to my garage and then do solitary confinement. And the latest product of this process, there's more that goes on to that. For example, we do cases, and Dave here from Stanford is involved in one of our case writers. So there's lots of people who actually help us along the way. Is called Scaling Up Excellence, and so my colleague Huggy Rao and I started this in I'm thinking about 2006, which is about the time the D School started. Here's Huggy, isn't he cute? We're actually standing against the Dumbarton Bridge. If you want to know why, I'll explain later. But crazy photographer. So Huggy and I, in 2006, in the early days of the D School, we started an executive program on customer-focused innovation. And the first year, a whole bunch of executives kept coming up to us and saying, essentially they talked about the same problem, which was, we have a little spot of innovation in our organization. How do we spread it further? Just sort of an interesting question, actually. And we realized we had quite terrible answers. So one thing led to another, and first we started drinking wine together and talking about it. And then we started doing some cases and some interviews and teaching classes. And then eventually we decided we should write a book proposal and write a book. So that's sort of what happened. And one thing I would say that's a little different from this book compared to my other ones, especially the last 2 years, because our goal really was, with all due respect to my academic colleagues, not to do something that was of interest to them. We actually didn't care very much about what they thought. We tried to write something that was for people who were in the thick of whatever is scaling. So that's our target audience. So if my academic colleagues don't like this book, that's fine. But if people are actually trying to do this, don't like it, then I worry. So what do we mean by scaling? We either have a very broad definition or a very imperial definition, depending on which reviewers you talk to. So essentially, you've got an organization or network. It's got a center of something that at least somebody thinks is good. We can talk about what excellence or effectiveness is if you want. I wasted many years of my academic career trying to figure out what that is. I'll probably bob and weave and give you a bad answer. And the question is, how does a leader or team spread it further without screwing it up? And that's the basic problem we've been thinking about for a while. And to give you a range of examples, one of the cases we write about, a company started by 2 Stanford students in a D school class. Pulse, it's an app. It was actually one of the very first apps for the iPad. Ankit and Akshay, the co-founders, actually waited in line on, it was April 6, 2010, bought an iPad and wrote an app, and they actually made $300,000 in their 10-week class. So pretty good start. So we sort of tracked them, and they were sort of interesting because they had real difficulty when they moved from 4 to 7 and especially to 11 in sort of coordination and interpersonal dynamics. And those numbers, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, when you're in a team and you get, especially above 7 or 8, things start getting ugly, especially as you get to 10. So that's sort of interesting. Another example that we read some about, we did not go to China to study it, a little different case. McDonald's opens about 1,500 stores in China, so that's scaling, I think. A different kind of scaling, somebody, both an ideal client and somebody who's worked a lot with the D School, Claudia Kochka, the first time that A.G. Lafley was CEO of Procter & Gamble, she was essentially in charge of spreading innovation and started and had just a few people and worked on just a few products and spread both people and also kind of something like the design thinking mindset around Procter & Gamble. Although one of the smart things she did, for those of us who know about design thinking, is she said she never used the term design thinking because she thought that it was kind of like jargon monoxide that would scare people away. So I thought it's sort of interesting that she did it but didn't label it. And then one of the cases, Dave, did you help write this case? Yeah. So this is a great case. Around the time when people were asking us these questions, Huggy and Dave worked on a case about essentially a small nonprofit in Boston that, very small, 100-person or so organization, 12-person campaign team. And what they did was they helped spread evidence-based practices from hospitals that had them to ones that didn't. And I'm not a really hardcore quantitative researcher. I could fake it researcher. I could fake it at various times in my career, but Huggy Rao is a real hardcore quantitative researcher. Sometimes it's 6:30 in the morning, we'll have a conversation, and I'll say, what have you been doing? And he'll say, I woke up at 5 and I'm reading a statistics book, because he does them for entertainment. That's the kind of guy that Huggy is. And he had his doctoral students in a class try to figure out what seemed to be the effect of the 100,000 Lives campaign movement on U.S. hospitals, and it looks like somewhere around 120,000 lives were saved. There's some disagreement about that, but it looks like it actually worked. So that's the sort of range of phenomenon that we looked at. And as I say, either we're coming up with a general theory or being overly broad. And one thing, just as a comment, one fun thing about having doctoral students is that they'll do almost anything you tell them, no matter how inane it is. And so I haven't said this in the audience yet, but since we're at PARC, I can't resist it. So I taught a doctoral class to just 6 students on the book Scaling Up Excellence, and I had them write the nastiest reviews they possibly could. And they were just fabulous. And that was like one of the nasty reviews things. We were so imperialistic that we claimed absolutely everything, so you can decide if we claim too much. So to go back to sort of the stuff in the slide deck, if I was going to say what's sort of our core message, I think it's a pretty obvious one for somebody who's been around scaling, but the obvious is sometimes worth repeating, that scaling isn't just about running up the numbers as fast as you can. It's about spreading a mindset. And there's different ways to think about what a mindset is. Shared beliefs, there's culture, there's different sorts of jargon. What we tend to ask for, and we're actually, life's going by so weirdly, we were just at Twitter yesterday. Huggy and I were talking to the folks at Twitter, and one of the diagnostic questions we asked to try to get to figure out what the shared beliefs are is, what behaviors are sacred here and which ones are taboo? And it's not a bad diagnostic question. In organizational cultures do vary on this. If you look, for example, at Apple, Apple is a place where secrecy is sacred. And it's so sacred that people, they say scared secret even, and people get shot very quickly for breaking that rule. In contrast, one of the scaling stars of the book is John Lilly from Mozilla of Firefox fame, and there, essentially, one of the problems he had there was that secrecy was so taboo that when he'd get involved in the product development process, like he'd just talk to somebody and it would be out on the web the next day, sort of a half-baked idea, which is actually sort of a problem, to tell you the truth. So he had to put in a little bit of controls for that. But that question of what's sacred and what's taboo is how we tend to think about it. To give you an example, Facebook, which spent a little money today, how much was that, $13 billion today? I mean, you got to admit that that Mark Zuckerberg has guts. Sort of from about 2006 to 2012 in particular, we had intermittent and sometimes intense contact with Facebook. And we also had Chris Cox, who's one of the guys we talked to the most, who sort of had a product and also was head of HR when he was about 26. They put him in charge of HR. I think Mark was not getting along with standard heads of HR. And so we had him and Mike Schroepfer, or Schrep, who are the chief technology officer. And it's really quite interesting. You know, we think about how frenzied Facebook has moved, but they're quite good and quite systematic about sort of pulling over and taking the time to instill what they think is the right mindset for running their business, which is especially move fast and break things. So if you're hired as a new engineer at Facebook, they actually don't figure out exactly what job you're going to go into for about 5 or 6 weeks. There's some sense of it. The main thing you do is there's a little sort of introductory speech, usually by Chris Cox, and they kind of get you set up with your computer and the like. And then you start working with 10 or 12 different groups over the course of the 6 weeks, and you do actual programming. And so this was about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago when we had Schrep and Chris Cox's class guest, and I just checked with them about 3 weeks ago. They say this is still true. So their definition of a successful first week is that you as an engineer have made a change in the site that you can show to your mother or father. So that's actually letting you touch the precious code base. So that's living the mindset, which is one of our ideas. But one thing to be clear about, and I talked about this already, is that a mindset that's right for one organization can be completely wrong for another. And we're actually very close to VMware here. I have a really bad sense of direction. I think it's sort of that way. Thank you. And so I was talking to some senior engineer at VMware, and I said, do you have a move fast and break things mindset? And he said, no, especially in our unit that makes software for nuclear submarines. We think that would be a bad idea. So what's right for one is wrong for another. You get the point. One thing that is a constant that we think of effective ones, this is Brad Bird from Pixar, is this notion of relentless restlessness, that whatever we're doing isn't quite good enough. We have to keep improving. That's certainly the mantra that they have at Pixar. And to me, it's a characteristic of at least every great team or organization I've ever been on, is that sort of feeling of dissatisfaction that, well, maybe we're doing okay, but it isn't ever quite good enough. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that Brad Bird got fired a lot. When he got fired by Disney when he was a young man, the guy he was a young animator, the guy who was head of Disney walked up to him and said, Disney Animation Studios, the job that Ed Catmull has now, and said, I'm satisfied now. I think we're doing really great stuff. And Brad, when he was a teenager, knew, I think they were called the 9 Old Men, the guys who did animation like Dumbo and Snow White and stuff. And Brad said those guys were never satisfied that their work was good enough. So that's the sort of spirit that I think we're talking about. Okay, so this is sort of the outline of what we're going to do. And there's one thing I've learned in life is to make sure to give you some time to talk. No matter what happens, there's a PowerPoint deck. Let's go to about 10:02, and I promise I will stop and pretend that we've reached the end no matter what, okay? Because I want to make sure that we have some time to talk. Okay. Two big lessons. One of the first lessons that we would sort of come to over and over again is essentially the social control mechanisms in organizations that were good at spreading and maintaining effective mindsets. We have this cute little quote, the feeling that the place owns you, so the feelings that you own the place and the place owns you. But really what it is that social control coming from mutual directions, that there's kind of nowhere to hide from it. So one organization, which actually they all screw it up, but generally doesn't, that I've worked with, which to me is kind of frightening, is the way that McKinsey, the consulting firm, works. The degree to which they have mutual influence and you have to live the McKinsey way, and I could go through a very long list, things like being discreet, putting the client first, pretending to be rational, even when you don't know what the hell is going on, would be another part of the McKinsey mindset that they don't like to admit, but that's part of it. But the degree to which they sort of put on this sort of perspective and have social control is unbelievable. The example here is when you look at hospitals that have especially high donation rates when somebody has died and they're on life support and they're trying to harvest the organs, is you'll also see that kind of social control where everybody involved, not just the doctors and the nurses, but the receptionists, the clergy, sometimes they'll bring in families who have been through a similar decision. There'll be all sorts of social control and social pressure for people to do, if you will, the right thing in their opinion. In that case is to donate. So that's the first big lesson. The second one is that we think of scaling as a problem of more and less. Sometimes we call it the problem of more. I think that's the title of the first chapter or the preface. But in the process, essentially, of growing, extending a program or whatever, you've always, at least organizations and teams that are good, are always thinking about things that used to work and are getting in the way, or maybe things that you've always done and have always gotten in the way and maybe we should get rid of. And there's a little picture. This is the only picture. I actually showed this at PARC once. I doubt anybody was here. I think my first talk was about weird ideas at work. And I paid to use this from the New Yorker. I'm not even stealing it right now. They're wearing those hats, stupid hats, and I don't know how it started either. All I know is it's part of our corporate culture. We all wear stupid hats, but in many cases we can't see them. So to give you an example, one of my least favorite organizations I've ever worked with, actually Huggy Rao is bringing in folks from them on Monday, so we'll see if they've changed, is General Motors. In fact, some of us in the Department of Management, Science, and Engineering had sort of a grant from them for some years from the R&D organization, and I swear, I see how much trouble I get in for this, although they did go out of business, right, and we bailed them out as taxpayers, who was a partial owner. I guess I can criticize a company that I helped save. Whenever we would try to do something, the first reaction was, no, we can't. And I swear their core competence was explaining why, even though what we suggested was right, that they couldn't do it because of whatever roadblocks were in the way. And one of them was, in the R&D organizations, that there always was a report they had to write, and they did not want to have to write the report. And one of the first things Ed Whitaker did was he got rid of a few reports, as you can tell. Another thing, IDEO, Don and I are IDEO fellows. God knows what it means to be an IDEO fellow, but we are IDEO fellows. Don Norman, sitting here in the second row. So in the mid-90s, one of my doctoral students and I, Andy Hargadon, did an ethnography of IDEO, and we used to go to the Monday morning meetings. And for those of you who know about David Kelly, who's the CEO, this is how he looked in the mid-90s. He's sort of like the Groucho Marx guy, sort of lying there in the middle. And there'd be about 60 people in the Palo Alto Monday morning meetings. And David absolutely was masterful at controlling conversation, making everybody feel energized, acknowledging virtually everybody in the room, really masterful. Then IDEO got to 150, and it was a nightmare. David couldn't do that. You'd go into a room, it would be, and so what they did was they split it up into studios and started having sort of an all-hands meeting every couple months, and the Monday morning meetings went to smaller groups. So you kind of have to do this organizations grow. And finally, back to the thing of things that you do when it comes to scaling, and I think this, I'm frankly cheating and going beyond scaling. one of the stars of our book. This is Donna Morris. She's head of HR at Adobe. And what Donna Morris figured out was they used to have, up to about 2 years ago, straight out of the Jack Welch playbook, stack ranking system, fire the bottom 10%, the lion's share of the goodies go to the top 20%. They would do this every year. I think at some point they might have had a head of HR from General Electric. I'm not sure, but sometimes that's where that disease comes from. And what happened is they had data that, first of all, they had a satisfaction survey they call the Pulse survey. The satisfaction numbers would go down. And then they'd look at who left the organization after doing the stack ranking ratings, and they'd have a sharp increase in the number of undesirable people, undesirable leaving, basically. The people they wanted to keep. And also she figured out that it took 80,000 person hours to do this. So that's a lot of people. And so they got rid of them. And they went to the system, and I don't have time to talk about in detail, the book goes into it in some detail, where essentially what your job as a manager is to constantly talk to the people you lead to try to help them do their job. And you're more of sort of like a business owner type. And one of the things that she said that was really funny, and I'll leave this, is she said, we took the forms and the technology away from them, so they actually had to look in the eye and talk to the people they led. I thought that was actually sort of an interesting point. And there's a fair amount of evidence, at least according to Donna, that a number of good things are happening, including more people they want to leave are leaving, and more people they want to stay are staying. At least, and now they're into sort of their second year of it. Okay, so those are the two big lessons. The key choice point. So the reason we call this Catholicism versus Buddhism, I actually have been criticized a little bit for taking liberties with religion, and people are very sensitive about it. But where it comes from is there's a guy, he's at the D School, he's also an early stage venture capitalist named Michael Deering. He's been teaching at the D School since 2006. And in the early days, we were sitting around, and Michael, who was altar boy of the month many times, his mother actually teaches in a Catholic school, he used to be a good Catholic boy, and he was describing asking us, so is the D School going to be more like the Catholic Church, or is it going to be more Buddhist? So is it going to be kind of what happens in Rome, this case being the D School in Stanford, is replicated everywhere in the world, or do we have a general philosophy that gets interpreted in a whole bunch of ways? So to go in probably less interesting but more precise language, are we going to sort of insist on sort of bringing out the clones, or are we going to allow local adaptation and customization? In this basic dimension of whether we insist on doing the same thing the same way in every place, or we lean towards more flexibility, is something both at the strategic and tactical level we run into over and over again as a decision that people have to make. Some organizations are decidedly, to use our terms, Catholic In-N-Out Burger. They're kind of all replicants. In-N-Out with copy, not In-N-Out, Intel with copy exactly. So using a Catholic strategy works great until it doesn't. A good example of this is what happened in China. So Home Depot got this notion that they could open 12 stores in China, and even though China is a do-it-for-me culture, that they could convert people to the do-it-yourself sort of mindset. And as one of my students, Xiao Wang, who is Chinese, said, in China, in addition to having a do-it-for-me culture, if you have enough money to shop in a Home Depot, you probably have enough money to pay somebody to build it for you, because labor is pretty cheap even now. So anyway, so all the Home Depots are gone. They all closed, the last one closed in 2012. IKEA, on the other hand, the IKEA stores, I mean, there's a number of differences, but most of the stuff they sell, 80% of it is the same stuff you can get in East Palo Alto. But what they really focused on was things like delivery and assembly, because it fit the culture. So they tilted a little bit toward Buddhism, if you will. The times probably when a more Buddhist approach is probably right is especially when you kind of know the mindset or approach that works best, but you don't know the specifics. So a good example is, and we probably all know this, there's a lot of evidence that when a nurse or a doctor, usually it's a nurse, gets distracted when they're giving us drugs, interrupted or distracted, they make more mistakes. So there's a little kind of field study experiment done by UCSF a couple of years back that allegedly reduced drug treatment errors 88%. I never quite believe these because they're self-report. But they basically allowed the nurses at different hospitals to use different strategies. So this is actually UCSF itself. What this is actually a sort of quiet or silent room where they can sort the drugs. And so that's one strategy. and this is a neonatal intensive care unit, and they wear those vests, okay? So there are different strategies. So that's more Buddhist. One thing that we like to warn about, especially since I'm a professor, and one thing about tenured professors, since I've been a tenured professor a long time, and Dave works with us, is that we all think that we're so special that no matter what logically should be done, the rules don't apply to us. And so those are the delusions of uniqueness. And in medicine, this is actually an interesting case. You can see where this is happening, that there's these pressures for standardizations, and physicians don't like it, despite the evidence that it actually works. And just real quickly, this is from an article by Atul Gawande in the New Yorker, where essentially standardization that was forced on doctors who did knee replacements had these incredibly positive outcomes, cutting costs by 50%, cutting pain. People are let out a day earlier. But since these were physicians, they all sort of hate the guy who rammed it down their throats despite these positive outcomes. So there's always that tension. Okay, so in the next 20 minutes, what I'm going to do is do sort of a rapid tour through some of our scaling principles. The first one, so Huggy's what he's probably most famous for is studying social movements. And he has this notion in some of his research that when you see collective behavior mobilized, usually you see a hot cause and then you see a cool solution. So the argument is there's lots of research that if you just make a rational argument to most human beings, it doesn't really affect our behavior. Or if you get them all emotionally cranked up, a la the Occupy movement. Does everybody remember the Occupy movement? They were all excited, but they could never agree about what they would actually do. So you have the hot cause and the cool solution. A good example of this, and I think I'll skip the next one just in the name of time, even though it's kind of cute, is when they kicked off the 100,000 Lives campaign, they had a couple of speakers to get people sort of roused up. So Sorrel King, whose daughter Josie, was that her name? So she died from a series of preventable medical errors at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. And so Josie's mom got up and said, please join the 100,000 Lives campaign. This was an audience of 4,000 hospital administrators, people from the American Medical Association, from insurance companies, things like that, from government agencies, and said, please join the 100,000 Lives campaign so there won't be another Josie. And the one I like best, although I talked to Joe McCannon, who's one of the heroes of the case, and he said that he thought that this was accurate, although it's not quite in this case. So Sister Mary Jean Ryan, who ran a large hospital system in Florida, she told him it was a moral imperative, and I like to say this is true Catholicism. The message sort of was, if you don't join our campaign, you're going to go to hell, is how I would interpret that. But that's my interpretation. I'm going to skip the helmet example in the name of time. The two things that Huggy talks about that you tend to see when this kind of thing happens, hot cause, cool solution, is people either name the problem or name the enemy. In Mr. Jobs, if there was something he was good at, there was always somebody he hated. I mean, we'd get people riled up. This example, which I'm not going to read, you can sort of look at it, I'll paraphrase it. It's from John Lilly, I've already mentioned. He was working at Apple. Jobs comes in, and somebody asks him about Michael Dell's suggestion that they close down the company and give the cash back to shareholders, and he says, this Jobs just want to, F Michael Dell. Got him sort of riled up, but there also was a kind of cool solution here, which was he changed to a 3-year vest, and also there was a lot of talk sort of about pride. But this notion of if you want to get people emotionally cranked up, to move to the next slide, and this is something that we see sort of over and over again, is that finding ways to arouse collective aggression or pride and to tie it to some sort of behavior is what you see when collective behavior tends to be mobilized towards a common cause. And one thing that Huggy really emphasized when we were working on the book together is that this is a good classic way that organizations sort of break out of individualism or the focus on individual self-interest is when they get sort of collectively aroused emotionally. Sometimes they start forgetting about that. Okay. The second one is, and this is basic behavioral science, and any introduction to psychology, if you had this, you probably learned this, but it actually works. There's lots of research that if you tell people they should accept a bunch of beliefs, and you should start believing this, and you should start acting like this, and they do not change their behavior, the likelihood that they will internalize whatever mindset you're trying to get them to believe is pretty low. Conversely, no matter what they're actually saying, if you get them to march in the right direction, their minds will follow. So this is why, in part, I think Facebook is smart. They give you the short speech about the move fast and break things mindset, and they have you live it for 6 weeks, for 6 weeks, so you begin to internalize it. And there's a really interesting case in the book, and a good friend of the D School. So this is Bonnie Simi. I guess it's the Winter Olympics right now. So Bonnie, she went to 3 Winter Olympics in the luge. She never won a medal. She also was a sportscaster for many years. She was a United pilot, quit, went to JetBlue, and eventually became an executive. Now she's head of talent. But I always tease Bonnie that she's had multiple jobs at JetBlue, but she really always has the same job, which is to fix what's screwed up. And that's right, Dave worked on this case too. So we have a case about Bonnie, and so it's really hard to condense this with you sitting here actually, but I'm going to oversimplify it. But so one of the things that happened was, many of us will remember that in 2007 there was what they called the Valentine's Day Massacre, where a couple thousand people were stuck on planes in Kennedy, and this actually almost killed the airline. And there was at least 2 sort of top-down efforts to fix it. And finally, they got so desperate, because they weren't making much progress, that they let Bonnie try this sort of crazy experiment I won't get into. But essentially, she got together a group of diverse people, and she said, well, let's map out what it looks like to close and reopen Kennedy when a storm hits. And the key part was, and they did it with sticky notes, sort of D-School style, and they put pink sticky notes wherever there was a problem. And the process was sort of eliminating the pink sticky notes. And I'm oversimplifying some, but not too much. And I got to look at, I've got like fact checker here. But one of the most interesting thing was, at one of the first meeting, the COO, Rob Rouster, I can't even pronounce his name, I think, asked people how many of them thought that this effort was going to succeed, and virtually none of them raised their hands. And Bonnie's perspective was that was okay, as long as they were marching forward in the direction she wanted them to go, it would be okay. And there really was a mindset shift in addition to a behavioral shift, because before this was when JetBlue was making the transition from being a startup where they thought that heroic actions could save things to thinking more systemically. And the evidence basically is actually JetBlue, this is one of the things that they're best at, is shutting down and reopening. And if you're a JetBlue customer, I guess you should know that if there's a storm, they're probably one of the worst airlines to take, because they shut down quicker than anybody else. And one of the reasons is that a lot of their other competitors, both for cost and convenience reasons, will engage in more denial that they've sort of broken through. At least that would be their argument. Okay. The third one is cut cognitive load, but deal with necessary complexity. So there's all sorts of stuff in the academic literature and in common sense about the importance of keeping things simple. Here's A.G. Lafley. He's talking about keeping it Sesame Street simple. One experiment from Babashev. This is, I think, a good way to sort of demonstrate the effects of adding a little cognitive load on people. To oversimplify it a little bit, but not much, what he did was had 2 groups of undergraduates, had one group memorize a 2-digit number, 16, something like that. The other group, 7-digit number, something like 3242257, and had them walk through a hallway, and not very far, just sort of like sort of past the exit sign, to report the number to the experimenter on the other side. But in between, they had the choice of having cake or fruit. And the ones who memorized the 7-digit number, and I keep going back and looking at this because I think I'm exaggerating, but I'm not, they ate 50% more chocolate cake than the ones who were trying to remember the 2-digit number. And so there's something when we get cognitive load on us, we tend to lose sort of will, and we tend to narrow that focus. And I think most of us in this room probably know this, and the late Cliff Nass, rest his soul, did great research on what happens when people start multitasking. They get dumber and dumber. And one of the studies I remember that he did showed that people who are heavy multitaskers are worse at multitasking than light multitaskers. So even multitaskers, it's not like a skill you can learn if you believe his research. So lots of evidence that cognitive load is bad for you. And sometimes organizations do this to us. And to give you one of the examples we're allowed to use from Karin Hansen from Intuit. So Intuit's basically, and you can't read this, you're not supposed to be able to read this. They basically, for about 4 or 5 years, have had a design thinking movement. And it kind of got kicked off by Karn Hansen and a pretty smart guy named Scott Cook, who's the co-founder of the company and largest shareholder. They got together and they made this thing, okay? And they presented it to a bunch of people at Intuit, big company-wide meeting. And I love the title, which is Evoking Positive Emotion by Going Beyond Customer Expectations in Ease and Benefit Delivery Throughout the Customer Journey. And Karn said people had two reactions to it. One was they couldn't understand it. And then when they saw it, the reaction was, this too shall pass, which we've all sort of had that reaction. So Karn said they kept sort of plugging away at it, and bless her how she lets us use it. So this is what they switched to eventually to make things a little bit more clear. And I think this is a good example of sort of cutting cognitive load. And one point we make in the book, by the way, is that sometimes to get here, assuming this is profound simplicity, sometimes you got to go through the jungle and go through the mess. So this might have been a necessary step for them. So I'm not sure it was completely dumb. But the issue is this notion that we sometimes hear, make things simple, makes things simple. The fact is that when you have an organization, and this is a scaling part, and I actually, one effect of doing this book is I've had more appreciation for the importance of hierarchy, process, and role specialization, which a lot of management gurus say you shouldn't have, but I can't figure out, given the logic of human organization, how as they get larger, how you don't have more of that. Maybe you would have a little less than your competitors, but I don't know how to do it. A good example is what happened with Larry Page. In about 2002, the company was about 400 people, and he couldn't stand all those pesky managers around, so he got rid of them. And so there was a few weeks there where you had 100 or so engineers reporting to one executive. This didn't work. And if you know about Google, they now really, really are focused at having great first-line managers, and they have evidence that it's really important to the productivity of their people and who stays and the like. So the general notion, and hopefully we can talk about this in crowds, is that as a program or organizational expands, you've got to add necessary complexity. But a good quote from Ben Horowitz, the VC, is you should give ground slowly and not get people to the point where they feel like they're walking in muck, but they have enough process they can actually do their job. And I really like this quote from Chris Fry from Twitter, great guy, heads engineering at Twitter, has a PhD from your department in cognitive science. He couldn't get an academic job. He's done okay, actually. I think he's the second highest paid person at Twitter, so he's doing all right. So he's got this quote, which is that the purpose of the hierarchy is to destroy bad bureaucracy. So you notice the hierarchy's there and the bureaucracy's there, but that's sort of his mindset in this perspective. So there's lots of things we can talk about in terms of what it takes to have an effective bureaucracy or hierarchy, whatever you want to say. Just as a psychologist, and in part because I was a Richard Hackman student, who was one of my mentors, not my only mentor, but one of my mentors, Richard, who passed away about 2 years ago, devoted really 50 years of his life from his dissertation on primarily to studying group effectiveness. And in fact, there's a great HBR post he wrote right before he died, if you say Harvard Business Review, Hackman, sort of myths about groups. It's like his career in like one 900-word post. It's sort of both wonderful and kind of disturbing because it's sort of all there, or much of it. And one of the things that Hackman argues, it's actually from the post, is his rule of thumb is that no team should get into double digits, because then all these bad things start happening as teams move from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And you think about a dinner reservation, the average dinner reservation in the US is 4. And you look at sort of high-performance teams where they have to cooperate. McKinsey engagement teams, sort of fire teams, they tend to be 4. And the numbers I look at are sort of 5 or 6 in what happens when a team jumps up further. And a great example, Larry Ellison, who eventually did buy his way to the America's Cup, spending about $500 million. And there was that great skipper, Jimmy Spithill, and team who didn't choke in the process, sort of an amazing story. But there was one point, some of you may remember, I think it was October of 2012, where they went sailing. They took out their brand new 72-foot boat. These are the best sailors in the world. Most of these people are gold medals, defending America's Cup champions, and so on. So they went from a 5-person boat to an 11-person boat. They capsized. So this is, to the sense of the scale, this is the bay. So that's 72 feet, and this is about 110 feet. So it's a $12 million boat. This is a $3 million mast or wing or whatever, okay? Okay, so now they're actually on the wrong side of the Golden Gate Bridge, and that's the mast being broken, okay? So when we talk to Jimmy Spithill and his team, One of the things they said was that they had a lot of problems with the coordination going from 5 to 11. Really serious problems because, and this isn't this issue of being able to hear one another because the boats were so loud that they all were mic'd and had earphones and microphones. That was the only way they could communicate even on the 42-foot ones because these boats, they go like almost 40 miles an hour sometimes, even faster. And one of the things that all the teams sort of eventually figured out to do, the few that actually were left in the America's Cup, was there'd be 11 people, but what they would do is they take the microphone off of 4 or 5 of the guys on the boat so that they could hear but not speak. So they almost effectively sort of brought down the group size. So I thought that was sort of cool. Okay. I've got 7 minutes. The next one, and I'll move through this one quickly, is in situations where excellence spreads. One of the things we argue is if you just spread a thin coat of something good, like do a little training, have a conference, have the PowerPoint deck, so by me talking about scaling up excellence for 45 minutes, I don't think it actually will help you scale up excellence. I think you have to do more than that. But what we tend to see is a pocket of true excellence created, and then it infects the next one. That's how the 100,000 Lives campaign happened. This example real quickly, so this was in Iraq, and what happened was that one little unit figured out that there was one of the grenades, these RKG-3 hand grenades, that when they hit something soft, they didn't blow up. So what they did was they put a trampoline on the side of their truck. So there's the trampoline. But the key thing was this thing called the Army Center for Lessons Learned, and it connected and cascaded this, and pretty soon there were hundreds of trucks with these trampolines on them. So I think that's a simple case. The more complex the behavior and procedures and technologies you're trying to spread, the more deep it needs to be. So one of the cases, which actually, with Dave sitting there, I remember how much work that he did, that he actually consulted on more. This was done with Isaac Weisberg. This was on essentially a lean movement that happened in Wyeth Pharmaceuticals. They were kind of prettying themselves to be sold to Pfizer, which happened eventually, was the sort of end of the story. But the way that they made changes, such as this one that Fifi was involved in, was they do mini transformations and transform what was happening in just a few places in these manufacturing plants. And then people like Fifi and the consultants, there was a lot of consultants involved, would help spread it to the next place and the next place and the next place. So this sort of connect and cascade process we would see over and over again. Okay, I'm going to make it the last one, bad to great. So this is a play on the book Good to Great, and what Huggy likes to say is that when he sees excellence spread, organizations don't go from good to great. What they really do is focus on getting the bad stuff. One of my favorite academic articles, if you send me an email, I will send you the whole thing. It's called Bad is Stronger Than Good, done by a bunch of psychologists, and they sort of march through every situation they can find, and they'll sort of give you 500 words and say, so bad is stronger than good. It's like a mantra that goes through it. And so the basic conclusion, bad behavior is stronger, longer lasting, more contagious, and more difficult to stop. And just to give you a little sort of relationship advice, one of my favorite and most informative and disturbing studies that I learned in reading this article was if in your relationship with your life partner, or at least the one, this part of your life anyways, if you get in a situation where for every bad interaction you have with that person, you don't make it up with at least 5 good ones, you are in trouble. Those relationships don't last. And I've been married for more than 30 years, and I sort of say, well, there's married and living together. I'm not sure where that exactly happened. But anyways, whenever I do something bad, I always say to myself, I have to be good 5 times in a row. So I use this strategically. And then you can look at some of the group dynamics literature. If you've got sort of one deadbeat jerk in your group, there's a lot of evidence that it brings down performance disproportionately. And the 2 reasons are, first of all, you spend too much time dealing with that difficult character and not enough time actually doing the work. And the other reason is, and this is in the article, there's a lot of evidence that bad behavior is more contagious than good behavior. So to go sort of switch to some of the settings that we looked at, one of the guys who talked at our class was a guy named Barry Feld, who was involved in turning around Cost Plus. When he took over as CEO, the stock was about $1, and turned around, eventually sold it for $26 a share to Bed Bath & Beyond. But what he did was he visited almost every store, and he said he'd look for two kinds of bad behaviors he'd try to nip in the bud. One was whether they greeted him and other customers. And ignoring customers to him was a bad behavior because when you don't greet them, they buy less and they steal more. And in fact, what he did was he teach them to use the greeting as a gateway to something good, to greet them and hand them a basket. So they're more likely to, put stuff in the basket. And the other thing he said, being an old retail guy, he'd asked to go to the bathroom, and the bathroom was dirty. To him, that was a sign there was a bunch of other things that were wrong. And to go back to Chris Fry, he did something really interesting when he got to Twitter, and I just got permission from him about a week ago to use this example, or maybe 2 weeks ago. What he said, he noticed at one of the first meetings he was at, they weren't, I don't have my cell phone, they weren't looking at him, they were always looking at their cell phones, And we've all been to the meeting, and he said, I'd ask them to vote, and they'd still be looking at their cell phones, and they'd raise their hands, so he said, I knew they weren't paying attention. So now what Chris does at most meetings, if it's a small meeting, he collects them himself. If it's a large meeting, he has the admins collect them. He takes their cell phones away from them. So to me, I think that's a pretty good example of clearing away the bad so the good can sort of flow. Let me wrap up, and I'm more or less going to make my time. So there's some of the scaling principles. They're slightly different in the book for a talk that seems to work better. 2 parting thoughts. I wish I could say that scaling is fast and easy. In any case that we ever looked at that seemed to be fast, easy, quick scaling, it doesn't seem to exist. And in fact, one of the more interesting studies, a study sort of like report that was put together by the Casey Foundation, and what they did was they tried to scour the literature and figure out what were the characteristics of educational innovations that actually stuck as opposed to those that didn't. And they named the report the path of most resistance because they would basically deal with multiple parts of the problem and pound away at it for years. And anything that was a quick fix, for example, the stuff they love to use at the University of Chicago is if we just change the incentives for the teacher, everything will fall in line. I can't find any evidence of that. Or students, sometimes they pay students for better grades. That stuff almost never works. So this idea of the path of least versus most resistance, that makes us nervous. And the other thing, to go back to our friend and mentor, David Kelly, typical sort of crazy look at David Kelly. So I've had kind of 2 scaling experiences with David Kelly. One as an observer, the other as a participant. It's really easy I sort of learned as an ethnographer to sort of watch people go through stuff and suffer. It really doesn't get to me that much. And in the old days at IDEO, sort of watching IDEO scale, people would often come to David and complain about how screwed up things were, how messy they were. And he'd say something like this, I'm sorry it's so messy and unclear, but sometimes we just got to push forward through the process, and it's never really going to go away. And it's kind of interesting that then when we started the D School, I was that person offering that complaint to David Kelly. And I think it sort of is true that the way that life is it's always messy and unclear, and people will, and I probably am guilty of this, will tell you these clean, beautiful stories of organizational transformation that everybody knew what the hell was going on. And when you're there, and if you talk to people honestly, and the Harvard Business School or Stanford Business School case writers have not come in and cleaned up the case with management's approval to make it prettier than it actually is, because that's what happens sometimes, that it's actually a mess. And I sort of go back to some stuff on mood, and I did a little stuff on mood, and Danny Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, has done stuff. And at least my reading of this research is if you think about the way that we individually or collectively go through life, we're kind of trapped in the perpetual present tense. And from a mood standpoint, especially if you have good mental health in some ways, things suck the most now. And when we think back to the past, since we have selective memories, we'll remember things as better than they actually were. A lot of evidence of this rosy retrospection. And then if we're reasonably optimistic, you look forward to the future and it might be great. And to go back to David Kelly, I've been thinking about this, and I think this is a lot of his style of management, because I've seen what he's done with IDEO, where he's just jerking. They've done all this sort of crazy stuff, and now the D School, he's telling us we're going to teach every Stanford undergraduate design thinking somehow or another. And really, we're going to And so what he always does is he always switches attention, either remember the good old days and how tough it was and we got through it and how great we felt afterwards, or it's just going to be so great, and he moves your attention away from the present. So as a sort of scaling trick, and we can talk about the ethics of this perhaps, but this idea of getting people to focus their attention on the past or especially the future, I think is sort of a scaling trick that keeps people motoring forward. Okay, so I almost made it a minute late. Comments, questions? You know, I'm like, this is a stylized condensation of a book, and whether I believe what I'm telling you or not, we'll see. So I want to see some of your reactions and comments. Yes, sir?
I know nothing about Facebook, but I have the image of your comments where there are 2,000 people handling the product, and at 5 o'clock the bell rings and everybody stops and installs what they did during the day. At 5:01 the bell rings again and they see all the chaos that's happened. And at 5:02 people are breaking out into fistfights because I fooled around with your code and you didn't know I was going to do it.
So, I mean, to that point, for some reason, and it's not like I'm an engineer at Facebook, but from the beginning they've sort of had this philosophy, and they've gotten bigger and they've had to have more organization. But in fact, you know, one time, this is 2008, we went to employee orientation, and they had 2 guys from Google, and they said, this isn't Google. We give you the code. You could bring down the site tomorrow. So, and there's kind of 2 ways to think about it. And I'm not defending them. This is what they descriptively said and what they say they do. And from all the engineers, I teach in the Stanford Engineering School, they say this is how it works. Somehow or another it works. And what Zuckerberg's philosophy, and we hear this from Chris Cox too, is that if people really understand what our goals are, and they understand the larger picture, you can trust them more. And besides, you know, it is just Facebook. It's not nuclear. I mean, when Facebook goes down, I'm sorry. I mean, I just don't, you know, it's not even like you can still start your car even when it crashes. So that might be it. But I would say it's always interesting to see a different philosophy in action. I mean, in the old days, they've gotten a little more orderly. Katie Jereminder, who was one of their first head of products, I met her, she came to a D-School class in 2006, and I said, who are you? And she said, I've got a 21-year-old crazy boss who seems to be doing some interesting stuff. And in those days, you know how Google has the 20% rule? She said, and I don't think they have this anymore, we have the 100% rule. And the concept was, in the very early years, is Mark would walk around and sort of talk about the philosophy, and he would kind of nudge them, but in theory they could do whatever they wanted. So you know, my perspective on organizational life is I kind of like to see it's like existence proof. The company exists, they do this, and Facebook does usually work. And remember, you're on a team, and I think what they do is they give you something that you can't screw up too much. So one of my dear friends, Diego Rodriguez at IDEO, longtime engineer, one of the things he likes to ask clients is, where's your place for failing? And I suspect that what they do is they give them a task that, so if you mess up the resolution of a photograph, it's not going to change the world, for example. So I think that's one of the ways they do it, is they give them a place where damage won't do stuff. But to your point, it's actually pretty interesting how far they've gotten, given a crazy model that makes some people's stomach turns, okay? I remember Katie saying, I can't even tell them what to do. I can suggest it, but I'm not supposed to even order them what to do. She was head of product at Facebook for a while. Yes?
I was intrigued by your comments about hierarchy and the benefits of managers. So Tony Hsieh at Zappos just changed their hierarchy to, you know, following holacracy.
Yeah, I know.
And got rid of management. They're now the largest company trying this.
So
can you
I wrote a LinkedIn blog post about this, and I went back and forth the holacracy people. First of all, they did not get rid of hierarchy. There's a guy named Tony Hsieh who ordered them to change dramatically, and they changed it, okay? So there is still a pecking order, and Tony Hsieh is at the top of it. So let's just start with, like, assumption 1. This is not. The second thing is, if you read between it, what they're doing is they're trying to push more responsibilities down on the team, but there are still people who they won't call managers, but whatever the hell they call these people, they're responsible for assigning tasks, and when people have performance problems, giving them negative feedback and removing them from teams. So I don't know, you can call them, I don't know, belly dancers, you can call them whatever you want, but to me that's a managerial function. But the concept of the holacracy, which I think you go back to Chris Fry's thing, the purpose of hierarchy is to defeat bad bureaucracy. They're trying to push more responsibility down. They're still having people do something that is a function that's similar to managers. So the holacracy thing, so if you look at the thread, there's somebody from the holacracy thing sort of weighed in and said, no, it's not like there's no process, there's no management, but he's just pushing stuff further down and giving people more responsibility, which I think is right. I think you do as much as you can get away with. But there's still a hierarchy, there's still process, there's still role specialization. I mean, if you're on a team and something breaks and you're not an IT person and you're selling shoes, there's an IT person who comes and fixes it. There's an HR person, whatever they call them. So I still think you could find role specialization, hierarchy, and other sorts of differentiation in the thing, although less than other organizations. You know, the holacracy thing is really interesting because I thought they were going to be mad at me, but they just basically agreed with me. Other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
So I've always felt that if you don't have a bunch of problems, you aren't trying hard enough. But you raise a good point here, that if you're growing fast and you got all these problems, people can be totally bummed out because it's nothing but problem after problem after problem. Have you seen very effective ways in your research of keeping score of victories so people can feel like they're making progress even though they're constantly faced with new problems?
Well, so I don't think of so much our research, although we talk about it a little bit, but there's some really interesting stuff by Teresa Mabile. Teresa Mabile is at Harvard, and she writes stuff essentially on small wins. And she actually did quite intense, she does very, very anal research and has a huge budget since she's head of the research budget at Harvard Business School, so she gives herself a lot of money. And she's a very careful researcher, and so she did all these diary studies, and essentially what she showed was the most effective sort of creative teams would focus on making little bits of progress every day and would have leaders who encouraged them when they had setbacks not to get too down. But this idea of sort of small wins and moving forward, regardless of the trouble you're having with the big picture, to her that added up to a bigger win. And certainly, you know, to switch cases, if you go to Pixar, I mean, that's very much how they think at Pixar. Because most of the time, from what I can tell, both from from reading cases at Pixar, interviewing people, and Ed Catmull has a great new book. I'm just doing this a plug as I love his book, Creativity Incorporated, that's coming out. Things were always screwed up at Pixar. In part to your point, because they were always doing stuff that was so hard nobody had ever done it before. So I think that is a sign when things are breaking. But if it always breaks and you run out of money, then your organization dies and you have to try again. This is Silicon Valley. But I think you're right. I think that's exactly right. One more question. Wait. Victoria. This guy? Yes. Just yell. I'll repeat it.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah.
How are you?
I'm good.
So there was a slide where you show a picture of someone leaning on the floor and talking to people.
That was David Kelly. Yeah.
This is an earlier slide.
It's one of the first ones.
Yeah.
What's your question about it?
So what he was doing exactly? Why he's leaning on the floor? And
so I used to go to those Monday morning meetings. The reason David was going on the floor, laying on the floor, was we would go into rooms that had no chairs.
Why is that?
Because it was downtown Palo Alto, and IDEO always had space problems. He didn't want to buy the chairs. A lot of times we would go into, because 60 people was big, a lot of times we would go into a room that was not heated. I remember it was in winter. And it wasn't even an IDEO space, but because he knew all the real estate brokers, they'd let us have the Monday morning meeting there. So a lot of it was, some of it was also the funky culture of IDEO.
It's a funky culture.
Yeah,
right.
yes. Maybe one more. Okay.
On your experiment about the cake and the fruit salad?
Yes.
So did you do that experiment without asking them to remember the numbers and see if 50% people would actually go for cake anyways?
There was some controls I don't remember. The thing that I do remember that I did not talk about is that he tested people where they had high or low impulse control. And even though social psychologists often don't like individual differences, that people who were under high cognitive load and had low impulse control, they ate most of the cake. And if they had high impulse control, they mostly didn't touch it. That explained actually most of the variation. That effect went away. So there was a personality difference. But I don't remember what the base rates were. I think it was something like when it was 33% cake consumption in the control condition comes back to me, but I could be wrong. But that's an interesting question. Do we declare victory, or do we have one more? What do you think? I
think we should say thank you to Bob for an excellent, very interesting presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria.